Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the live stream, Rethink Life. I want to welcome everybody. We've been gone for a few weeks, but we did post a bunch of excerpts from Betty's class, which was a couple weeks ago now. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check those out, we have a playlist with the excerpts from the intensive class in October of 2022, and we'll be adding some new ones in there periodically as we go along as well. So we're going to continue to add new excerpts, so pay attention to that. And that's all going to be out on YouTube at our YouTube channel. And I recommend that you subscribe and get notifications and things like that. So I want to welcome you all here today. For those of you who are new to the Institute of Metaphysical Science, I want to tell you a little bit about the Institute. That's who sponsors this channel. We were established in 1959 as the Margaret Laird Foundation, researching, exploring, living, and teaching the science of being and the causal nature of consciousness. Our website is at scientificmetaphysics.org. And we are continuing on with the booklet, What is the Idea? It was an address that Margaret gave live, and we have since published the address as a booklet, and it's really excellent. I know that you can, at our website, which is scientificmetaphysics.org, you can go out and get the PDF version. I believe right now the special price on it is just $1.50. That's going to be going up in the next week or so. I'm not sure. I have to double check. But if you're at all interested, go get it. If you go out there and it's not available and you just watch this, but we're not live, then you might have missed it. All right, but on we go. So at any rate, this episode is called Soul in Action. So we're going to be exploring this whole notion of soul in action. Hi, Betty. How are you doing?
Pretty well, thanks.
Excellent. So one of the things in the description for this session, basically what we said was you have a sense of yourself. You're consciously experiencing what you call people, places, events, things, objects. Just look around you, all of that. Now, soul is the word for this sensing or reason principle forming. Soul is a wonderful word for the idea, that which sees the sunset and all its beauty makes the sunset. So soul is a word for intelligence. This is right from What is the Idea on page 12. Soul is a word for intelligence. Intelligence is a word for the dynamic of truth, disposing of ignorance and superstition, and revealing the fact that the human race originated spiritually and is therefore divine. Soul. So with that, anything you want to say to introduce this topic, Betty?
No, I think that does it. We're really concerned with the idea with anything that we're talking about, because the words are only a method of communicating and discussing something, but the idea is really alive, and it functions in your life to the degree that you're listening to the idea. If you're playing with the words, it becomes an intellectual pursuit, which doesn't do much for you except you have fun doing it. But when you really get with the idea, you find out that you have a different sense of what it is to live. You know, if I'm full of the idea and I'm moving out from that, the experience I have of living shifts from when I'm Betty being busy about a bunch of stuff. You know?
Yeah. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that if you want to leave a comment, type them in. We will get them during this live session, and we're happy to answer and address anything that you've got. So type those in. We love to get all of that information. Also, all the comments, all the questions and things like that. So let's dive right in. And What is the Idea on page 13? Margaret Laird wrote, conscious experience, or God, is a state of egoism. Egoism is a term for the idea that mind is elemental and all constituting. Being is thinking.
Yep.
So unpack that a little bit, Betty.
Well, we think. What this is really telling us that when the process called thinking is occurring, it's not personal. There is an intelligence functioning in the universe, and that is the thinking that we call thinking. But we don't give it credit. We think this thing thinks, and this thing is just the way I look. It's not the way I am. The divinity that's present when Betty shows up is the thinking evident. That sound all right?
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Now, how did Mary Baker Eddy say that statement in Science and Health? Well, on page 181, lines 1 and 2, she said, mind, God, is the source and condition of all existence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically what she said. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I wrote a note about that because you weaken or destroy your power when you resort to any except spiritual means. That's another quote from Science and Health. But she's pointing to this capacity that we have to allow the source and the condition, the origin of ideas to be other than personal, to be something that originates fundamentally out of being itself. And so you learn to be a listening for the ideas that are really freely available all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We don't hear them or feel the impact of those ideas much when we try to think that we have to figure it out, when we have to do something about having a good idea. And then what's a bad idea?
Right.
All that personal attention to what's actually divinely present all the time. And it just takes a willingness to let this thing just be present and pay it no mind. Be a listening for what's really present for you. Ideas are everywhere, and all it takes is a listening.
Mm-hmm.
You think you get a good idea. What you did was listen, and the ideas are coming and going all the time.
Yeah, just shows up.
Yep.
It occurs for you. You see it. You can be open to it. When you stay open and you stay willing.
Yep.
So the rest of that note says, see that all is infinite mind. All being is spirit. One's point of view or your language world doesn't exist as an is, even though we think it might.
My point of view is Betty's take on stuff.
Right.
This is nothing compared to what's actually present.
Right. That's what reminds me.
View is always of reality itself, the only way I can see it at the moment.
Right.
It's where it shows me where I'm standing.
Yeah.
It just says, okay, Betty, this is where you are right now. You got some going to go, You got to let go of Betty to really see what's present.
Right. And it reminds me what Margaret used to say, forgive me, Lord, for requiring my world to treat me this way.
Yeah, exactly.
Total responsibility for what's going on and showing up in her world.
Yeah.
All right.
And she knew that Margaret got in the way of that, just like I know now from living a long life, that I get in the way of all the stuff quite often. But I also know that I have the discipline to tell Betty to just cool it.
Yep.
And listen.
Yeah. All right. Now, in Mind is the Athlete, you say, so the thing we're looking at and what is the idea is conscious experience or God is a state of egoism. And egoism is a term for the idea that mind is elemental and all constituting. Being is thinking. And in your book on page 186, you say it this way. Thinking is the substance languaging human living. Solutions actually precede problems. Solutions or answers are verities which define the problems and provide the path to their own discovery.
Yep.
So problems are your best friend in a lot of ways, or problems are the wake-up calls you need to get with the program.
Yep. And you that sentence also points to the fact that we're dealing with the done. We're not doers. Perfection is. And it looks like, in the human sense of things, a progression of going towards something. But that's just the way it looks, because that's my point of view. The fact is, I stand in perfection as divine being. The belief that there's a Betty gets in the way of my clarity on that quite often, but I've learned to just let that be, because there's nowhere I have to go to get better. Right. Nothing is ever going to be more perfect than it is right now.
Right.
No joy is ever going to be greater than the joy that's present right now. Health is never going to be any more wonderful than it is right now. And I'm not talking about Betty's concept of health or any concept of health, but health itself, whole, perfect, complete, all the time, standing in perfection.
Yeah. So we talk about, you said that that there's no we're not doers, come from the done. And we're talking about soul in action.
Yep.
So when you say come from the done and there's no doer, then it distinguishes for me the soul in action piece, because action, and I look at it and automatically I equate action and doing.
Doing is always going on, but I'm not a doer.
Okay.
It's like thinking is always going on, but I'm not a thinker.
Got it.
Being is always going on, and I'm not a beer. There are no ERs, no ers in it.
Okay. So soul in action then is being itself, being showing up exactly the way it looks.
It's sensing. It's hearing, it's seeing, it's, all of the things that soul is when we define it with an ing on it. That's the action of soul.
Right.
And it's soul presencing rather than Betty being something. Soul presencing gives me all the sensing I have. Clarity of vision has nothing to do with the eyeballs.
Okay.
It has to do with soul presencing.
Yeah.
And clarity of soul presencing takes care of whatever human vision has going on.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure that that's clear. So if you have a question, type it in the comments box and we'll address it. Otherwise, I know that everybody's completely crystal clear on the subject.
Well, the thing that's interesting is that when I let Betty be and I'm mentally, consciously present, recognizing and acknowledging soul fundamentally as all action, all presence, all being. If Betty has a vision problem, it usually clears up. Mm-hmm. Because the Betty tells me where I'm standing. If I'm standing in the fact of myself, which is all is infinite mind, then for that fraction of a second, there isn't any Betty doing anything. But what looks like Betty is just fine. Mm-hmm. No problems. And we call it healing or whatever, but that's a language version of all is well. One thing going on. All is infinite mind, infinitely manifest. And right now, this is the best view I've got. And it shifts with the perception of perfection that's presently acknowledged.
Yeah.
Does that say it? Okay.
All right. Now, in What is the Idea on page 20, Margaret Laird wrote, there will always be body because there will always be soul. There will always be sensing or sensation, since being functions is being as awareness. So that harkens back to what you just said, that it's sensing soul, it's all of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
The God idea in action is man.
Yep. And Science and Health, Mary Baker Eddy said on 522, starting on line 10, existence separate from divinity, science explains as impossible.
Yeah.
Because divinity is all there is.
And if you were getting really nitpicking about the way you say those things, you would say sensing is existing rather than existence, like a dead end.
Right. Okay. All right.
It's
And
an
then yep. And then in your book, you say on page 187, the human individual is not a separate entity conscious of anything. Consciousness is all there is.
Yeah.
And then further on in Mind is the Athlete on 186, the page before actually, you say self-aware consciousness sources man.
Yep. Because consciousness would be the God idea in action. And it constitutes sources and constitutes and conditions and expressives and all the rest of it. All there is and all that can be. And always, 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 the thing you see in the mirror is your perception of yourself. It's the thing that it's the best view you've got of the reality that's present.
Yeah.
And whenever you can let go of this thinking that it originates anything or sources anything or provides you with anything or can be joyous or sad or depressed or elated, all that stuff is foolishness. It's got you hooked into thinking you're going to make this thing do something, like be happy, or make this thing do something like find a job. It doesn't do that at all. Employment is a full-time thing. It's present right now. If this is my best view, okay. But it is functioning on the principle that's present, like all is infinite mind, and mind intelligently functions all the time perfectly. And living that fact is what looks like healthy, wealthy, wise living in the human perception. It's always originating in the idea that's present, never in the view of the language that you have, saying, oh, this is my life. This is a point of view of what life is all about. But the fact of life is way, way more magnificent than that.
Right.
Yep.
All right. Now, and what is the idea? Also on page 20, Margaret Laird wrote, it is not possible for me to know anything beyond my senses or soul, beyond myself as conscious identity. The body is not a mechanism to be influenced and controlled by mind.
Yeah, I really see that.
So I cannot know anything beyond my senses.
Well, Mary Baker Eddy says conscious thought is body. Now, whatever the conscious thought is, constitutes your experience of body for you. If you think it's something you can see, feel, hear, taste, or touch, or see in the mirror, or whatever, push around, control, manage, and operate with, you're looking at your own concept of that idea. You're not looking at the fact of it at all. And only when you're in touch with the fact can you make a difference in your own living.
Right. It's not when you're fiddling around in the picture.
Yeah, it's not when I try to have Betty be a certain way or try to improve Betty. Who cares about Betty being improved?
Right.
Because Betty is taken care of automatically when I'm being myself consciously.
Okay. And so the second sentence, the body is not a mechanism to be influenced and controlled by mind.
That's right. Conscious thought is not a mechanism to be influenced and controlled.
Right.
It constitutes, it's not a thing I can push around.
Right. I mean, it reminds me of that documentary we were watching on Edward Bernays. The Edward Bernays, the guy who basically invented PR.
Okay. That
Remember?
with
Yeah,
Freud.
and Sigmund Freud's nephew.
Yeah.
There is a documentary called The Century of the Self. That's what I'm referring to for those of you listening. But anyways, we were watching that last week. I was in San Diego. We were watching it last week, and it's the first thing that brought psychoanalysis, or the way the brain works and all that, into marketing or public relations or whatever, call it propaganda. And then he invented the first PR agency that brought this into being. And so as you're watching, what you start to see is how much influence that has had over government trying to control man's baser instincts so that we can have a functioning society. And what they learned is it's just not possible to do it. And I remember sitting there and talking with Mom and saying, and we looked at each other, and it was like, because this is not where thinking occurs.
Right.
So kind of an interesting.
But the belief about thinking occurs there. And the belief shifts with the perception of what thinking actually is.
Yeah.
So I don't make a big deal about whatever Betty's up to, but I know that as I live the fact of what's actually going on, Betty's going to be just fine.
Yeah.
I leave her alone.
Right.
I can't say that often enough, and I've said it a million times, but if you can leave yourself alone and be the divinity that's present when the self shows up, looking like you,
yep,
you'll find great freedom.
Yeah. Okay, now we've got a question. So here we go. John Nada wrote, what is the IMS perspective of necromancy, mesmerism, or hypnotism?
Yeah, those are all points of view in human living, have nothing to do with reality.
Okay. Anything more you want to say there? Or John also asked clarifying questions.
All of those, necromancy, mesmerism, and hypnotism, are techniques to try to get the human being to behave and perform at a different level.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to influence or manipulate the human being into being better or wiser or smarter or funnier, or you name it. And you can play those games all you want. But when you really make a difference with yourself is when you leave that picture alone and look at the fact, if I'm not this two-legged animal that needs to be moved around, what is it that has this thing be free and happy and joyous and prosperous and all the rest of it? Well, science has discovered that when I can acknowledge the fact that's present, that has me looking like Betty, it has me show up, period. I know that I consciously am. But what I fool myself with is thinking the thing I see in the mirror is who I am. No, it's just the piece I have to play the game of human living. But the being that has me occur has always lived. It's eternal, no beginning, no ending, whole, perfect, complete all the time. And my view of it is my current living. It's the way it looks for me right now. It's the view I've got. But I don't depend on the view to provide me with joy or well-being or good health or anything else. I depend on my idea consciousness to take care of all of that, and I leave Betty alone pretty much of the time. I find freedom in letting Betty alone because it's not the generative source of my well-being.
Right.
Fussing around with Betty leaves me very much steeped in the belief that I'm a two-legged thing, helpless, have to be fixed, have to improve, have to learn, like I'm not standing in perfection, and being the ground of perfection is the source.
Yep.
It's a done deal.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Yes, thank you very much. We love the comments and the conversation. So he's got a follow-up. So let me bring that up. Just a moment. Okay. So you were talking about Bernays and propaganda. So there is a belief in influence. How do you protect against or avoid this influence? What was really interesting is that we were at lunch we were at dinner and with some people that we've known for a long time. And I was out in San Diego. And one of the gals at dinner brought up Edward Bernays and wanted to know if I had ever heard of him since I work in marketing and things like that. And I said, no, I've never heard of him. So anyway, she told us about it. So I looked it up and I wanted to know what this guy do. If he's like the most famous kind of impactful guy that nobody's ever heard of, that seems to have made a big difference in the way that history would talk about, the human stuff that goes on, before World War I and all of that. And so we were watching that documentary, and Bernays is the guy who the US government hired to have the people in the United States get behind entering World War I. They continued to use that influence or whatever, so that when we freed Europe, when we came in and that was the end of World War I, that there were people chanting in the streets for, was it Woodrow Wilson? Was that World War I? I can't remember, but the president of the US, they were chanting his name as the freer, the person bringing freedom. So I think
World War I, yes.
Right. So the belief or the look of influence would maybe be the way it looks on the human belief level, the way it looks, but what's really functioning? What's really causing that look to be? So how do you protect against or avoid this influence? Know who you are. Acknowledge the facts of being, and know that you are the world you walk through. There's no out there to protect against. See, if you're
willing to step beyond the look of yourself to the idea that has you be. It's like Shakespeare said, there's a divinity that shapes our ends. It's that divinity that you want to have consciously present, and leave the look of you alone. The more you can leave it alone, the freer you are. Trying to move it around to avoid influence, trying to protect it against influence, trying to do anything with it has you locked into that I live and move and have being as this two-legged animal, and I'm hooked.
Right. And I would say it has you believe that the boundary of who you are is right here in this.
And you're pretty helpless.
And when that's your motive, then you got a lot to protect against and manipulate and try and control. If there's only one thing going on, then I am the world I walk through. That the being me is showing up in my best view. There's no separation.
And when you say I, you're not talking about Kim.
Right.
You're talking about divine being that's present, that has Kim show up as her piece on the board, so to speak.
Right. So hopefully that'll help clarify, John. All right. Great questions. Thank you so much. Appreciate all of that. All right. So is it possible? It is not possible for me to know anything beyond my senses or soul, beyond myself as conscious identity. The body is not a mechanism to be influenced and controlled by mind. And some additional thoughts there. Body is conscious experience, conscious thought or mind, identified, it's self-identified. The word God has so many false connotations that in using it for the God idea, unless you stop and think, the idea is lost.
Yep.
And that's also on page 20 in What is the Idea? Man is the action of the God idea.
Yeah. So man is not Betty. Man is the presence that allows Betty to show up.
Yeah.
And if I stay with the presence rather than the picture called Betty, I'm home free.
Yes.
To put it simply.
Okay. So then in Science and Health, page 466, starting on line 21, Mary Baker Eddy says this: soul or spirit means only one mind. Science will declare God aright, and will demonstrate this declaration and its divine principle, making mankind better physically, morally, and spiritually.
Yep. You know, when you're consciously aware of the God idea as the only active presence, it takes care of the human picture.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
And then you said this on page 188 of your book, Mind is the Athlete, Betty. You said, we rejoice in the knowledge that the one and only body is soul, conscious thought, the sensing of good in and as every organ and function.
Yep.
Is all soul in action.
Yep. There's no authority outside of our own divine being.
Yeah. And that's basically right from your book as well on page 189.
Yep.
All right. So is there anything else that you want to say to wrap this up?
No,
anything more you want to add?
Anybody have any questions? Otherwise,
Yeah. So this is all from What is the Idea? That's what we're looking at. So we're exploring the ideas and what is the idea, and then the writings from Mary Baker Eddy that says similar things, and then the writings of Betty Albee from her book, Mind is the Athlete. Now, What is the Idea is a pamphlet available at the IMS website. And you can go to scientificmetaphysics.org and get that. You can order and download the PDF and have it pretty much immediately if you want to follow along. All right, we have one more comment. John said thanks. Thank you, John. That was awesome. Thank you for participating. Totally appreciate that. All right, so we have nothing more. So you can go and explore these ideas. You can go listen to the excerpts from the intensive class that was held a couple weeks ago. And we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central. And until then, let's go play.